Hey guys, welcome. Welcome to Triple R here. Today we're going to be watching What Would World War III Be Like? This is the channel Whatifalthist most popular video. And, I'm a great fan of Whatifalthist, and I just thought, I'll share my thoughts on his most popular video and see how things go.
The long peace has held for 80 years. There hasn't been a major war between industrialized powers since World War II.
That is true. That is true. And a large part of that, I think, is demographics. What you notice here is that, in all these wars, there were so many young men present among the great powers, right? That's one of the things that when you have lots of young men, you get lots of fighting. Okay, I feel like the West has, matured a bit. It's no longer full of young, testosterone-driven young men who want to, fight and relieve that steam. So yeah, in that sense, everything is good. So let's take a look here.
It's always hung over us, like a horrifying sword of Damocles, ready to slit our throats. The world is already facing incredible geopolitical tension. This is for a variety of reasons that I covered in this earlier video in this series of videos I'm making about modern politics. This video exists to discuss what would happen if war were to break out, not why or how it would break out. What would happen if the unthinkable were to occur? Who would fight? Who would win? How would the war be fought? The answers will be horrifying.
Yeah, so let's get rocking, man.
Hear about World War III.
Let's get ads. We don't want to see a bunch
of
on
ads, Discord.
Right? React to the actual material.
A rough map of the coalitions in the conflict would look something like this. People don't tend to view the world this way, but similarly to before
Chinese
World
versus
War
American,
I, the world is now broadly...
So, World War III was originally used to refer to the Soviet Union versus America. The Soviets never came close in terms of, their economic supremacy, but they did have, lots of nukes, obviously. So that's the reason why America was so afraid of the Soviets, even though economically they were never close to surpassing them. So apparently he thinks China is going to fight America. I find that quite strange. China is not traditionally an expansionist power, okay? Usually, if you go back to the era of Zenki, right, what did they do? China collected tribute, right? They didn't raid and conquer these territories. They sailed in these giant treasure boats, okay? They could have easily conquered, these regions along the Indian Ocean, but they chose not to, right? Colonization was not their thing. They thought that, economic tribute was more right, because of course they saw themselves as, just the rightful rulers of the Middle Kingdom. Everyone else,
in two alliance structures, the Chinese and American.
Okay, so
the politics we get fed in the news is often remarkably misleading to the actual nature of geopolitics. Countries that like to scorn America the most in public, like Western Europe or the Philippines, are actually from American allies and getting more so. Similarly, China has hidden massive influence in poorer nations that rarely gets talked about. This map is open up to a great deal of interpretation. Russia and China, for example, are currently allies, but their partnership is tenuous at best, and it wouldn't surprise me if we see China and Russia go to war at some point before the mid-century. In the U.S.-Chinese war, the Europeans and Russians
Russia and China are definitely cold allies, right? You remember the Sino-Soviet split, right? They are not, what you call, they are what you call allies of convenience, right? And allies of convenience always fall apart when the metal is tested, right? The Soviets and the Americans were allies of convenience in World War II, right? They did not last, definitely. Especially a hot zone is going to be the Far East region. If you look at any population density map, you notice that the Chinese have hundreds of millions of people living in this stretch of Manchuria. The Russians have tens of millions at the most, right, living in this region. So, it's not even close, right? The Chinese could easily sever Vladivostok and the Russian Far East from the rest of the European core of Russia.
At best, and it wouldn't surprise me if we see China and Russia go to war at some point before the mid-century. In the U.S.-Chinese war, the Europeans and Russians might just sit out and watch from the side. Similarly, Turkey and Thailand alternate sides depending on the wind. Turkey and Russia have serious beef now, so I'm putting Turkey in the American camp for now. Similarly, Thailand is politically aligned with America, but culturally and economically is either close to China or a Chinese puppet, so I put them in the neutral category. China has lots of allies in places like Africa and South America, places like Venezuela, Tanzania, or Angola, but these countries are so poor, militarily weak, and removed from China, all these countries, the Chinese in the conflict. And so,
what you would notice in all the world wars is, people would say, oh, look, the entire world was against Germany. The entire world, in a sense, was just, America, Britain, and Soviet. Everything else was just, tag along. They just declared war for the sake of it, right? Both of these nations barely made any dent, in the war effort. So
These countries remain
I don't
neutral.
expect
It's sort
them
of similar to how Iran and
to
Argentina were
change.
sympathetic to the Nazis in World War II, but stayed neutral. It doesn't matter how the
Fun
war will
fact,
break out. For the
indeed.
sake of the scenario, let's just say it does. Something goes horrifically
Um,
wrong. It doesn't matter if it starts in North Korea, Armenia, the Himalayas, or Ukraine. A global conflict just
yeah,
starts.
Himalayas
Something else I need to cover
definitely
before we
is
continue to the
where I
actual
can see
scenario
it
is the role of
starting.
nuclear bombs. I don't think any of the great powers would use nuclear weapons. First of all, most nuclear powers, including China, with the exception of the US and Russia, have treaties saying they won't use nuclear weapons unless their home countries are directly nuked first. Given the
Yep,
Chinese Communist Party's
yep.
record of keeping
Nuclear
promises, this
weapons.
isn't much in of itself, but nuclear war is in no one's self-interest. No one wants the end of humanity, and more importantly, everyone knows that no one wants it. If anyone is to use nukes, it would be one of the weaker and more insecure powers like Pakistan, North Korea, or
Yeah.
Iran, but these wouldn't have enough ability to shake the human race. Restraint is actually the norm in military history. Total wars were only really waged in the 20th century AD and 3rd century BC for reasons due to advancing military technology. Chemical warfare was never used in the Second World War. Noble
Um, no chemical warfare in World War II. Um, yeah. Low noble casualties in high Middle Ages. Um, yeah, exactly. So, yeah, people forget that the wars of the 20th century are really unique because of how massive they are, right? And even if you look at the wars of the 20th century, what you find is that the casualty rates are exaggerated because of famine, right? Because of effects of war, not actually, like people, slaughtering, killing each other like that. So, yeah, that's something that's interesting to know. The number one killer in war is usually disease or other effects, is what you find in history.
casualties were remarkably low in the High Middle Ages, and the draft didn't appear until the Napoleonic Wars for this reason. Also, missile defense systems like THAAD have gotten good enough they can knock missiles out of the sky at a 50% rate. A nuclear war in 1980 would cause 1 billion casualties. Now we're at 300 million. Hypersonic missiles might be changing this, but I'm not sure where we are in that arms race. Similarly, countries like China are at such a disadvantage in the nuclear arms race with the Americans that they would want to press their advantage in conventional warfare with their massive demographic and industrial advantage. We would likely end up with a treaty where by which the Americans, Russians, and Chinese would agree not to nuke each other if neither side agreed to attack their countries proper. No bombs or troops in Honolulu or Shanghai. Finally, before we start, I want to have a note of modesty here. Every military prediction has gone pretty wrong. People far smarter than me with far more information than I have predicted practically every war terribly wrong. If heaven forbid a war were to break out, I would be very wrong in at least a couple things. The war would generally form a ring around the Eurasian continent. The Central Powers, as we can call them here for fun, would occupy the center of the Eurasian continent, while America, which we can call Oceania for fun, would control the oceans and maintain a coalition around the edges. In this part of the video, we're going to go through each theater of the conflict going clockwise, starting in Korea. The Korean Peninsula would be a nasty fight. North and South
Korea. Yeah, Korea, North Korea with the Tin Pot dictator. The power I'm most afraid of in the world is not China or Russia, right? It's North Korea because of just how unstable they are, right? North Korea is like it's almost a horror world, right? The people have literally no escape, right? Imagine if you're born there, right? You are the unluckiest man, woman, or child on earth, right? If you're born there, it's so horrible, right? I can't even imagine how it would be like, living there all your life. Your life is gone, your life is wasted. And I eventually think that North Korea will collapse, right? Because it's a family dictatorship, right? And if you try to keep it in the family, eventually things are going to turn sour. Right? Remember Kim Jong Un's cousin he had to kill off because he could have possibly been a threat to his power. He could have been more liberal. I eventually think power dynamics is going to kill North Korea, and I'm going to be so glad if it happens during my lifetime.
Korea both have some of the biggest militaries on Earth, with in sheer numbers, North Korea being nearly as large as the United States. North Korea has an immense amount of missiles, and so could turn Seoul, a city of 10 million people, into rubble pretty quickly. This is the most heavily defended region in the world, and so the North Koreans would incur heavy casualties crossing the border. Massive Chinese armies would cross the border, pushing back the Americans and South Koreans by sheer weight of number. However, some factors make me think America would be able to stabilize a perimeter in South Korea. Firstly, the peninsula renders the Chinese advantage in numbers less, as the Americans can maintain a tight defensive perimeter and use naval forces to control coastal regions. This plays into the American military doctrine's number one advantage, sheer firepower. Similarly, Korea is a mountainous region with brutal weather, continually shrinking the amount of areas America has to defend and
So he thinks it's going to be a repeat of the Korean War, right? That could definitely be the case. The Korean War is the world's most, I think, forgotten war of the 20th century, but it is arguably the most pivotal war of today because it's still going on. People forget the Korean War is still happening. Okay, it has not officially ended.
giving the defenders yet another advantage. The South Koreans likely fight like demons in order to protect their homeland, knowing what North Korean conquest would entail. Also, in the previous Korean War, the Chinese' main advantage was how low-tech they were. Chinese armies could climb mountains living off a bowl of rice and attack Americans from behind, or lose 1/3 of their men in a blizzard and still outnumber the Americans. As China has become a wealthier nation with a more high-tech military, this stopped working, thus making Korea's mountainous geography play even more into America's advantage. The Korean Peninsula likely stabilized into a horrific.
Wait, sorry. So he's saying that Chinese armies could live off a bowl of rice, and as China has become wealthier, it won't work. I don't quite understand. The Chinese still have the advantage militarily in terms of numbers, right? The sheer numbers. They have over 4 times the population of America, right? Imagine that. And this is gonna be right in their backyard. So I see really no no issue with China in this war.
Military, this stopped working, thus making Korea's mountainous geography play even more into America's advantage. The Korean peninsula likely stabilized into a horrific stalemate. An interesting alternative is that the US would invade Vladivostok in Russia in order to create a second front and try to pick a fight further away from China, and thus one they'd be more capable of winning. I'm not sure how this would turn out. The main next theater would be Taiwan, a decade try to pick a
Oh, we got the second Russo-Japanese war here. That's gonna be an interesting showdown right there. Um, the Sakhalin is taken by the Japs. Okay, that's cool.
fight further away from China, and thus one they'd be more capable of winning. I'm not sure how this would turn out. The main next theater would be Taiwan. A decade ago, I'd just say that America's overwhelming naval advantage would mean they just blow the Chinese boats out of the water. However, the Chinese have put massive effort into land-to-ocean defense systems, meaning I'm not sure if American ships could survive the Taiwan Strait. The projections I've seen from the Chinese government, for what it's worth, say the US can no longer protect Taiwan after 2020. Considering how Chinese forces are massing in southeastern China, this seems plausible. My guess is the Chinese would seize Taiwan in case of a war. Once in Taiwan, the Chinese would start.
Oh wow. So the Americans could no longer protect Taiwan after 2020. Well, now it's 2022. The Americans seem to be protecting them quite well. Now the question is, will the Americans go to war over Taiwan? For now, I believe the answer is yes. Right? They make so many semiconductor chips. The Americans just outsourced all these, fabrication labs to the Taiwanese in the 90s. Now it's biting them in the rear because China, of course, is much more powerful than it was in the 90s. China used to be as poor as Africa, okay, back then. So keep that in mind, just how fast China's ascendancy is, and U.S. is rightfully worried, my man.
Start to put in defense systems there in order to push their perimeter in the South and East China Seas further out, in order to start menacing the Philippines and Okinawa. One of the things people just don't believe when I tell them is that the US and Vietnam are now good allies. This is since in the US, the Vietnam War was a seminal and traumatizing moment. Meanwhile, over the last 1,000 years, China's invaded Vietnam 20.
Yep, the U.S. and the it makes me kind of sad, right? The Vietnam War happened, and it meant nothing, obviously, because now the U.S. and the Vietnamese are already allies, right? So the Vietnam War basically achieved nothing at all. It was just so useless, right?
27 times. This 1,000 years of continuous resistance to the Chinese, French, Americans, Japanese, and local Southeast Asian powers has made the Vietnamese a formidable warrior people, but would it be enough? No. Geography plays too much against Vietnam. Cambodia and Laos are Chinese allies, and the roads are good enough that Chinese can move troops into these areas and so attack Vietnam on every border. Vietnam is a very long and thin country, and so if you can split it in one place, the two main power centers in the far north and south are broken. Similarly, the Vietnamese heartland around the Red River lies very close to the Chinese border. The Chinese quickly conquer Vietnam, and like every time before, the Vietnamese retreat to the jungle and fight a guerrilla campaign. Thailand is surrounded by Chinese allies and is friendly with China, and with the fall of Vietnam,
I find this interesting. So he thinks that Laos and Cambodia are going to go with the Chinese. I'm not sure. Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam, they used to be part of French Indochina, right? And the culture is, very, very similar. Um, I find it hard to believe that, if Vietnam was on the side of the Americans, that Laos and Cambodia easily couldn't be on the side of the Americans as well.
Vietnam would switch sides to the Chinese, similarly to how they allied with Japan during World War II. Malaysia and Indonesia are generally American allies, and this would be cemented by them being coastal nations with coastal capitals. If these nations were to side against the Americans, the US would just bomb their capitals into rubble. The US took the deal to cement a defensive perimeter in the Kra Isthmus in Thailand, using the jungle terrain and peninsula to protect its position. In general, in the Far East, the Chinese were able to take the initiative in the early stages of the war, since although their military is weaker by many metrics than the Americans would be defending the entire world, and the Chinese would be just focusing on East Asia, and thus would be able to concentrate their forces into that area. The next theater is India, an American ally, who would be fighting a horrifying defensive campaign. India is surrounded by
India is screwed in this war, man. So the things you want to take a look at is in the east, India is especially screwed, right? Look at how thin that chicken's neck is, right? That connects eastern India to the rest of India. Bangladesh, being Chinese, is really going to put a screw in India's geography, because they just had to march like 20 miles, and India's eastern side is screwed. And then Pakistan is going to be the biggest issue here. So the Pakistan and India, the thing is, they shared this incredibly fertile Indo-Gangetic plain, right, that straddles these borders. And if you look at videos, it's just barely a fence, a low-level fence that separates these powers in the Punjab region. So that's definitely going to be really extremely bloody if things got as bad as a world war. Wow.
Chinese allies, with Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Burma all Chinese allies. Bangladesh is simultaneously both a Chinese and American ally. Sri Lanka, being an island, would end up being an American ally in real terms. Also, India wouldn't let Bangladesh choose who they were going to side with. They would either strong-arm Bangladesh into their coalition or conquer it.
Yeah, the Indians are just going to take over Bangladesh. I mean, honestly, they've done it once in the 70s. They can do it again. Especially, since Bangladesh is not actually part of Pakistan anymore. It would actually be easier.
However, all of this means India would end up fighting a three-front war. Pakistan would invade the northwest, while the Chinese would launch an attack over the Himalayas. Much of this campaign would be determined by how big this attack would be.
The Himalayas, that is actually India's greatest asset, right? The Chinese are not going to come flowing over the Himalayas. Anything, they're going to supply Pakistan, which is going to fight India, right? The Chinese and the Indians, I feel like, are never going to fight a large-scale conflict. Okay, the Chinese are definitely going to take Arunachal Pradesh, maybe these eastern states, but in the actual core land of India, where the massive amount of population is in the Indo-Gangetic Plain, Chinese really can't penetrate that over the Himalayas, right? You're not going to send troops marching over Mount Everest by any means.
B. The Chinese have been building a lot of highways in this area and would be able to build them quickly with their construction abilities, unless the Indians were capable of stopping them, that is. The US could likely shell the crap out of Rangoon, thus rendering Burma pretty weak, but it would still be a useful vector for Chinese forces to attack eastern India. The Indians would likely stop them in
The Burmese, I don't know, man. I feel like the Burmese are just going to sit this one out. I mean, they're like North Korea, but a light version, right? They're not as bad as North Korea, but they're just cut off from the world as
the
well.
geographic choke point in the jungles of the Brahmaputra, where they stopped the Japanese last time. If the Chinese and Pakistanis could form a decent coalition and break into the North Indian Plain, the Indians would be done. Delhi lies in the northwest of India on the North Indian Plain. India is militarily and industrially far less effective than the Chinese. The US would likely sink immense resources into keeping India alive. Much of this conflict is determined by how far India is developmentally now. Is Indian nationalism strong enough in the peasantry and lower classes that they keep fighting a war with philosophy?
Yeah, the thing is, yeah, India has been invaded so many times, right, throughout history. If you think about it, the Indians have been invaded, every single time from the northwest. So that's why I doubt, honestly, that apart from Arunachal Pradesh, that this gamble up in the north is going to pay off. Um, but yeah, they're definitely going to stabilize the borders.
India is military. Our India is developmentally form the massive military industrial complex it would need, and would its roads be capable of?
Yeah, India's region, it has so many people, right? It has so many people. It has more people than Africa, freaking Africa. Um, so it doesn't make any sense why it's still so poor.
Supporting its military supplies. Would pulling people off the farms result in starvation in the cities? Factors like this would determine the outcome of this conflict. With both nations here having more combined population than the entire world during World War II, and with both sides using human wave tactics and prone to committing atrocities, just this theater of the war would probably be the bloodiest war in history. Going into the Middle East, things get more complicated, as they always do in that part of the world. We've already ascertained Turkey would be an American ally at this point. Turkey is the giant of this region, with an economy larger than Saudi Arabia and Iran, its major rivals combined, and the best military. Iraq is both an American and Iranian ally of this region, with an economy larger than Saudi Arabia and Iran, its major rivals combined, and the best military. Iraq is both an American and Iranian ally, and likely end up siding with the Iranians. You would generally see a coalition of Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt against Iran, Syria, Iraq, and Russia. The Turks would be able to conquer Syria and northern Iraq, failed states for the most part. Iran and Saudi Arabia would get stuck in an intractable conflict. The Iranians would block out the Straits of Hormuz, thus killing trade to the Persian Gulf states, their rivals. The US would...
Wow, Turkey. This seems like a neo-Ottoman. I see the memes, about Whatifalthist being like a Turkey weeaboo, so to speak. I can definitely see the truth in that. My man, this guy, so he thinks that Turkey is going to reconquer Syria, Iraq. Wow. Yeah, this is the Neo-Ottoman Empire right here, my friends.
Too much on its plate already, would ignore this for now. Saudi Arabia likely wouldn't survive this total war, with a terrible military except for a couple elite regiments and barely having social cohesion now. The Turks and Iranians seem to have no grudge with the other now, and so I can see the two powers agreeing to not fight the other and partitioning the region. The Azeris and Turks would combine to crush the Armenians, would get stuck in an intractable campaign in the Caucasus with the Russians. No one makes progress in the Caucasus since the climate is so hellish. The only way the Turks would gain an advantage is by getting the Chechens, fellow self-governing Muslim sort of related peoples in the north slope of the Caucasus, to rebel against the Russians. Moving into Europe, the Russians would drive into Eastern Europe. This brings us to the very unclear point where I'm not entirely sure what Russia's military capabilities even are now. I've heard very conflicting reports where their military is either barely...
Oh, my friends, yeah, I think this video was made before the Ukraine. Russia's not going to go anywhere. Okay, Russia is already stuck in Ukraine, my friends, for months and months and months. And Ukraine is like one of the poorest European countries, right? They're not going to fare very well against modern European armies at all.
Functioning, or has regained most of their Soviet military projection abilities. The Russians' ability to show up is decisive here. Belarus being a Russian ally means that the Russians would be able to sever the Baltics and conquer them with relative...
Oh boy, oh boy. Yeah, the Russians are definitely not going to achieve anything here. At best, they're going to hold their current boundaries, right, with Belarus and so on. They'll be lucky indeed if they don't lose land here.
Ease. Ukraine similarly would be relatively easy pickings. I've heard it would take several months for America to move a full field army into Eastern Europe, and so the Poles have to hold out until then. Whether they'd be able to depends on if the Russians would fully show their colors. In general, the population and economy 1/10 China's size, the Russian front would always take a backseat to the Asian. I could see Crimea becoming a frontier. Like in the Crimean War, America and Turkey would control the Black Sea, and Crimea, being a defensible position on the Russian side of the sea, would be a perfect staging ground to strike into the soft Russian underbelly. Military technology would have a decisive effect here. I'm just not sure how. Every war in the modern world fought decades since the last major war is a complete unknown. Exactly how technology will affect the war. On one hand, missile communications has fought in the wars in Iraq.
Yeah, technology is definitely going to be a major part here. We could actually see space wars, right? Space conflicts as part of this greater war.
Demonstrate that modern technology has just made the blitzkrieg more powerful. The only honest conclusion we can reach is that we just don't know. There are several things to consider, however. One of which is that when generals are in doubt, lives are lost. An aim of every military is to lose as few of their men as possible, and so when generals don't know what they're doing, lives are lost. I've read some estimates saying we would have casualty rates higher than World War I. A very cynical way of viewing it is that due to the immense population growth of the last few decades, human lives are getting to be a cheaper commodity, especially for nations like China or India. The bigger countries...
I agree. The value of human life has been going down and down and down. right? If you go to like any job, right? They used to be that if you had a job, you weren't really seen as replaceable. Now you go to a job, there's a dozen people behind you waiting to get your job, right? If you fall, if you drop dead, or if you get fired, right? And it's horrible.
Countries today can fight the Somme several times over and not bat an eye. Several new fronts would open up. Trump was mocked for creating the Space Force, which was viewed as ridiculous. However, in real terms, it was actually a very smart decision. With practically our entire civilization wired through satellites, we have to keep them safe in order to keep our society alive. A new front will open up in space between rival satellites. Similarly, there will be a new front in digital warfare. With our lives so dependent upon the internet and computer networks, shattering your enemy's
Cyber warfare, it is definitely a major thing, and the Russians are pretty good at that. So don't underestimate them.
defenses could be a killer move. This could result in shattering a rival nation's electrical or banking system. Of logic bombs and missiles could shatter a nation's supply chain. That much of modern military technology is failures result in delaying production of modern weaponry. We could end up with a war with some modern tanks, for example, and swarms of easy-to-make these factories and missiles are
Oh wow. Yeah. So the thing is, America has been untouchable, right, for basically all of its history. The thing is, with space wars and with increasing technology, that's no longer the case. That's gonna be really dangerous for America.
systemic failures result in delaying production of modern weaponry. We could end up with a war with some modern tanks, for example, and swarms of easy-to-make pseudo-World War II era ones. When you consider that a modern tank can easily take out 12 World War II era ones, it means we're returning in many ways to the Middle Ages, with a few knights cutting through peasant cannon fodder like butter. The social effect tank can easily take out 12 World War II era ones. It means we're returning in many ways to the Middle Ages, with a few knights cutting through World War II.
I'm not sure about tank, although I think it definitely drone. You've seen Ukraine, right? The drones can just take out so many tanks. Drones are definitely a game changer and here to stay. Will only increase in importance in the future.
Era ones. When you consider that a modern tank can easily take out 12 World War term. A positive side effect of this would be an immense technological revolution. We seem to be on the verge of multiple technological revolutions now, whether possibly biological, nanotechnological, robotic, or AI. Total wars have always
Definitely. Yeah, I always like to think if you look at the stretch of 20 years, 1900 to 1920, right? You invented planes and you were using it to kill people. Okay. What comparable invention happened between 2000 and 2002, 2020, right? You might say phones, but the the iPhone has been around since 2007, right? You can't say that it's radically different. But planes went from fabric and wooden things like that to just actually killing people and flying across oceans. It's insane. Um, yeah, penicillin especially saved so many people.
put technological progress into overdrive as governments put massive investment into the military and people risk technologies that might not work. Coming out of this war, we'd be far more technologically advanced than we would going into it. However, the negative side effect of this is that troops in the battlefield would be faced with nightmarish technologies. It's hard to say what technologies in development will eventually see the front line, but we're currently seeing space-based lasers, robotic bee assassin swarms, StarCraft-style electric body armor suits, and
Yeah, man. Robots would be so cool. Honestly, I think eventually they're going to deploy robots to fight wars just to minimize human casualties.
invisibility cloaking technology all in some form of development. In general, if it exists in a science fiction movie, a military is probably the onus will be on them to rely on robots or things like drones. However, if human judgment is their ability to distinguish civilian from combatant gets worse, the Central Power's greater willingness to commit these kinds of atrocities with robots will give them a greater advantage. In the long term, the use of
Yeah, my friend, drones, that's exactly what drones are. Obama's been using them, Bush has been using them, Clinton has been using them, so it's definitely going to be a big part.
the invention of the machine gun, which was supposed to make war so horrifying that it could never be fought again. This argument always misses and continues to miss two important variables. Firstly, that weapons tests in labs are always painfully inaccurate for the effects of terrain war. You can bomb areas into oblivion, but you need the infantry to control them.
Who would win? I'm going to guess the Americans. Let's see what Whatifalthist say.
There are several variables to determine who the victor would be, the first of which is how much the Chinese would show up. I've heard very conflicting reports on what the Chinese military's capabilities are. I've heard it's simultaneously very corrupt and has done a good job at reform. From my experience having been to China, personal experience of dealing with Chinese systems and reading history is that the Chinese either completely fail by letting internal corruption and division eat themselves alive, or they bring their A game and completely crush everyone else. This is the main deciding factor for a war. If China's capable of using its massive population and industry to full bear, they will win, and if not, they won't. China likely has immense potential industrial ability in a war, and a huge amount depends on how much the Americans can disrupt this and also retool American industry. As mentioned before, a similar situation exists with
The thing is, though, the Chinese have never been, much about offensive wars. Again, like I'm saying, right? You never heard about Chinese troops, landing, I don't know, in Africa or Australia or Indonesia, right? They always restrict themselves to the Chinese heartland. So I think that's going to be their weakness here. They're not going to really be able to project that power like the Americans will. And I think that's going to be their downfall.
Russia on a smaller scale. On the American side, America will have to pick up the slack for their coalition for a while until they're mostly pacifist allies, like the Western Europeans or Japanese could pick up the slack. Although the Chinese have immense mobilizational abilities, the massive size of America's alliance means that they'd be able to win if everyone mobilizes. If America's allies can mobilize within the first year, and America has not lost a decisive defeat, the Americans will win. The Americans, for example, have nearly all of Europe as an ally, a region that has immense potential if militarized. In a good scenario, the Europeans will be able to pick up the slack in Europe and the Middle East. The Americans, for example, have nearly all of Europe as an ally, a region that has immense potential if militarized. In a good
Um,
America has not lost a decisive defeat, the Americans will win. The Americans, for example,
yeah, so this is a map of all the lands that the Europeans colonized. I feel like it's a bit misleading though. The Europeans were at least several decades, if not centuries, ahead of the rest of the world, right? When they did this colonization, that's what allowed them to do. Now the differential is not as great. So I really doubt that the Europeans are going to be able to help as much.
Of nearly all of Europe as an ally, a region that has immense potential of military, especially stay alive and are capable of fully industrializing. India is a decisive partner that will either disappoint or impress depending on their current developmental level. Arming the Europeans, Japanese, and Turks would have massive geopolitical effects after the war that I don't want to get into. This brings us to the ultimate failure of American policy in Europe, a European backstep, dislike of America by their populations. If the Russians were to crush America and Eastern Europe, these Western European nations, far enough away to feel secure, could create a deal with the Russians that would give the Russians Eastern Europe in exchange for cheap resources. This would end up being a complete collapse of the American position in Europe. China's biggest weakness is they're thousands of miles from their oil supply and can barely feed themselves. With America blocking their naval route, they'd strengthen their land route through Central Asia to the
Yep, famine, right? The Chinese do it the biggest and the best, and the famine. I'm going to predict hundreds of millions of people dead, honestly.
soil. However, this is a long, arduous, and tenuous supply line. The native populations in the areas in between don't really like the Chinese either. Their leaders just want money. The US will support Islamist movements in Central Asia, including likely, ironically, the Taliban, in order to sever Chinese supply lines. Alliance that no one really likes China. The Chinese have a tendency to act in a very arrogant and unpleasant manner in geopolitics due to their thousands of years of hegemony. If the Russians were to face a crippling defeat of the Americans and with the Chinese settling more and more of far eastern Siberia, I could see the Russians backstabbing the Chinese. Similarly, I can see the Central Asian regimes, already unstable and unpopular, collapsing due to populist anti-Chinese rebellions, angry at China leeching away resources and their boys dying in Pakistan for conflicts they don't care about. On a separate note, the US may appear very divided now, but still has a good deal of civic pride and has a history of coming together in crises like Pearl Harbor, Fort Sumter.
Yeah, the U.S. is actually not that divided at all. I mean, the map.
On a separate note,
this map is misleading, right? Because when you think about it, it's more purple, right? These are just county-wide maps, but the truth of the matter is, the truth is much more purple. There's a mix of Republicans and Democrats living alongside one another. Um, and war always, mobilizes Americans, right? Regardless of your political bias.
Note the US may appear very openly, so it tends to appear in worse shape than it really is. Similarly, American foreign policy and public opinion tends to have the emotional state of a teenager due to its Calvinist heritage and isolationist geography, alternating between immense self-guilt and loathing and extreme aggression and self-righteousness. If America was attacked, it would go from guilty to aggressive and self-righteous very fast.
Yeah, geopolitics is a sport. It definitely is. I really feel sorry for Ukraine right now. It's definitely not a sport for them. But the U.S., you just see pundits and Redditors going back and forth. Oh, go Russia, go Ukraine. It's
Fast. China and Russia are very patriotic now, but their forms of patriotism come from the loyalty populations that have had their leadership give them real physical benefits have. However, since these are autocracies in which the population has very little control or responsibility for the government, this could quickly transform into hatred if the war effort went badly. Due to the massive geographic regions involved and probably super high casualties alongside nuclear treaties, this wouldn't be a war ended by seizing the enemy's capital, but one in which one nation's wheel broke before the others. To summarize, America would win this war if it could mobilize its allies effectively, and if not, China would win. Without the help of its allies, America just can't get over the fact that there are 4 Chinese for every American, a kill ratio that's almost never been matched in history. Well, that was a cheery video. If you
Wow, yeah, that was a great video. Yeah, the Americans would definitely win. And, honestly, I really don't see World War III happening like this, just because China is really averse to war, right? Chinese don't want to fight wars. As long as you keep them happy and satisfied economically, they're going to, stay happy and satisfied. Especially offensive wars. I have never, personally seen the Chinese actively go out and seek war, right? So it would only be if the Americans actively provoke them in East Asia, which hopefully the Americans don't do. But as long as that happens, I really don't see a war happening. If anything, the most likely, be a regional conflict. Because again, nations have much more autonomy nowadays, right? They're not going to be forced into alliances and into agreements. And in the days of European colonialism, right? If your mother country was fighting, you had to go to war, right? That's the reason why India was fighting in World War One and two. So, I really don't see many of these powers fighting, honestly, and I really don't, it would be extremely irrational for the leaders to lead their countries into the most brutal war in the history of mankind, right? Without getting much benefit in return. But yeah, that's my thoughts. And thanks for watching Triple R, and I hope to see you on the next one.